This episode put the final nail in Orel's coffin. It's called Alone, and it sets up a lot of things that we'll see later, but also you got to remember a few things about this
Almost 2 years ago now, I released my video unpacking Moral Orel, and basically overnight it blew up so far beyond anything I'd ever experienced or imagined. Today, it's still far and away the most popular video on my channel, yet it definitely was not perfect. And of all the things that I've wanted to go back and fix, one first and foremost is the episode Alone. If you haven't already watched the original video, I definitely recommend starting there. And if you haven't watched the series yet, then what the hell are you even doing here? In a show like Moral Orel that focuses on the repercussions of religious oppression, the Season 3 episode Alone is a standout. It's a series of vignettes of 3 characters that, up until this episode, had been relegated to the background, and this is why it's so powerful. We've seen how a singular family can be twisted beyond anything we'd call functional, and now we see that in this town so gripped by this warped version of Christianity, absolutely everyone suffers, especially those that don't fit into their established roles. The vignettes follow Nurse Bendy, Miss Sculptham, and Miss Censordoll. Each of them represent a different way in which the dogmatic fundamentalism of Moralton has repressed women and forced them into the corners of society. Nurse Bendy, like many young women in the real world, was brainwashed into believing that the only value she had was her body and that its only purpose was to please men. Taken to the extreme, it caused her to never fully develop psychologically. Miss Sculptham, on the other hand, was made to believe the same lie, but went in a different direction, instead choosing to create a purpose for herself in baiting and capturing a serial rapist. Only it wasn't a thing easily done. The experience not only left her with crippling anxiety and OCD symptoms, but a misplaced attraction towards that man. Finally, Miss Censordoll is the result of being an exception to the rule, in a society that really doesn't care for exceptions. She was mutilated, robbed of the symbol of her sexuality, the one most important to Moraltonians and tater tots alike, her ability to bear children. Thus, she had no purpose in the society that birthed her. Now, even though Moral Orel overall pushed boundaries, especially in its final season, it was Alone that truly ventured into unknown territory for what started out as a silly cartoon that poked fun at Bible Belt towns. Alone was basically Dino Slut Apocalypse and company driving a bulldozer right through those boundaries. And sadly, it caused the Adult Swim bigwigs to cancel the show. In fact, on Max, the little episode blurb cheekily acknowledges that the episode was the final nail in the show's coffin. So, why? In a show that had events such as a child forcefully impregnating the town's women or a drunken father shooting his son and then gaslighting him about it, why was it Alone that cemented the show's fate? Now, I think the best way to explain this is to deconstruct each of the characters through their vignettes in Alone, as well as the context surrounding the episode. Before we go on any further, I want to address the women in my audience. Hi. I'm sure, unfortunately, the types of abuse and trauma that we discuss will be nothing surprising or new to you, if not in these extremes. So I just want to say that when I'm explaining things, I'm doing that mainly for the benefit of the guys and the younger people in my audience. I'm not trying to mansplain anybody's trauma. That's the last thing I want to do. So, in my first video, I created my own term called reverse flanderization. Put simply, it's the tendency of the show's characters to turn from caricatures into actual, fully realized people by the end. Many commenters pointed out that, hey, I'm pretty sure that's just character development. And yes, that is true, but I think it's a specific type of character development. Where normally we see realistic but flawed characters grow in some way, reverse flanderization would be a one-note joke character growing from that into one with an actual inner life, emotions, thoughts, ideas, all the things. Nurse Bendy absolutely goes through this change as well, starting mainly in this episode. Throughout most of the first 2 seasons, she's shown to be ditzy and incompetent, the stereotypical blonde.
I knew it. That beep, it always kills them.
Pretty enough to have skated by in life solely on her looks. Only as we learn in Alone, we'd had the wool pulled over our eyes the entire time. Instead of seeing Nurse Bendy for who she actually is, the writers made us see her as other Moraltonians saw her. Not a person, just fodder for church gossip. Dumb, yet at the same time a wily she-wolf looking to steal your husband. Alone shows us how far from the truth that perception actually is, and makes us stew in our own shame for having thought those thoughts. Instead, she was a victim in more ways than one. When she was still a minor, Dr. Second Opinion's son committed statutory rape and impregnated her. Given that she's about 24 during the events of the show, and her son Joe is 12, well, I'll let you do the math on when he was conceived. She went through one of the most traumatic events a person can experience, and then was forced to live with the reminder of that trauma for 9 months, before yet another extremely traumatic event, birthing a child at the age of 13, because of course abortion wasn't a realistic option in Moralton. Man, why does her story sound so familiar? I feel like I've heard about such things in recent news, but I can't quite put my finger on where. You might know someone that got pregnant in middle school. It happens all the time, unfortunately. And if you do, then you know the stigma that comes with it. The whispers in the hallways, the rumors spread about you among students and adults alike. Preteens are fucking ruthless, and that stigma is amplified 1,000 times when living in a fundamentalist Christian town. Likely nobody looked at Nurse Bendy the same ever again. It followed her throughout school and into adulthood, since Moralton is such a small, closely knit town. How could they forget? Given all of that, it's absolutely no wonder that she never developed into a stable adult. In real life, around 40% of pregnant teens never finish high school, and even more bleak, less than 2% finish any college degree by the age of 30. So the fact that she's employed as a nurse is an absolute miracle, and a reflection of her true self, determined and resilient. Unfortunately for her, this was only the beginning of her suffering. Not only did her new reputation earn her the attention of adulterers like Principal Fakey, but she wasn't even allowed to see her son. Dr. Second Opinion's son evidently wanted to sweep his misdeeds under the rug, and thus refused to acknowledge her as Joe's mother.
My mom must have been old too, 'cause she died of old age right in the middle of my childbirth. Bullseye!
This is gaslighting on a grand scale. Seemingly nobody in Moralton questioned the doctor, at least not enough to say something publicly. This refusal of reality would have caused the then teen Bendy to question herself. Was she just too young to be a mother? Too dumb? Was the whole ordeal just the overactive imagination of a young girl? She likely questioned her entire worldview. All of these things eventually led to what we see in Alone. By this point, over a decade later, living in this town which had pigeonholed her as the town slut, never having a healthy romantic relationship, she invented one for herself. On a first watch, if you're not paying close attention, the whole vignette can come off as a little silly. Why is this grown woman having a teddy bear dinner party? Why is she freaking out so much about the teddy bear falling on her back?
No! Hubby, you can! Not you!
I don't think any context would have made her story funny, but with that context, it's an absolutely awful situation. She was replacing the family that was torn from her. Her only human connection was through sex, which understandably didn't interest her. So, teddy bears. Rather than it being the result of a delusional, silly girl, it's the result of someone truly isolated while being surrounded by a supposed tightly knit community. She has regressed back to a younger age, a time in her life before her assault, when she was still safe. It's a coping mechanism.
We need family because they care that I'm a real person. who has thoughts of sadness sometimes.
It's the result of Christianity being warped from a belief in the goodness of helping the less fortunate into one of judging anyone different. It's why Nurse Bendy is alone.
Up next, if you like oral, you'll love moral. Moral Oral.
By the time we get to Miss Sculptham's story in the episode, a pattern is beginning to emerge. All three of these women are examples of how women in Moralton are oppressed via their sexuality, and how it's broken them in various ways. In the case of Miss Sculptham, it wasn't the sexualization of older men. Instead, it was the Christian ideal of celibacy before marriage, and the lack of male attention that kept her downtrodden. So much so that her quote-unquote first time was with her rapist, which she then developed Stockholm Syndrome-like symptoms for. At some point prior to Alone, Miss Sculptham had heard about a sexual predator in Moralton and decided to take things into her own hands to capture him. She colored her hair back to black because she heard he didn't like blondes, and she left her door unlocked to lure in Mr. Creepler, the ice cream man. Mr. Creepler, much like the other characters, began as a joke, or at least something that we were supposed to laugh at, if somewhat uncomfortably. Back in Season 2, when D.O.A was trying to become Miss Sculptham's new favorite, he had a run-in with Mr. Creepler, revealing the man's true nature. Only, like with almost everything else, we didn't take it too seriously.
Ew! Yikes! What?
It's like in the original video, when I said,
It starts out fairly innocently with things like Orel getting addicted to crack in this sort of, aw shucks, kids will be kids sort of way.
like, clearly, a kid getting addicted to crack isn't an innocent thing for the show to portray, and neither is D.O.A nearly becoming yet another sexual assault statistic. The innocent part is in how the show frames it, the way it's played for more laughs than for serious consideration, complete with upbeat, silly music.
You keep turning me on.
That was absolutely on purpose too, just like with Nurse Bendy. When the serious is later revealed, we are forced to reflect on our prior knowledge and reaction to it. In Season 2, we were put in the perspective of the average Moraltonian. That darn old Mr. Creepler's at it again. Womp womp. But in Alone, we are forcibly shaken out of that mindset, seeing things more objectively. Anyways, in Miss Sculptham's vignette, we see her struggling with some crippling anxiety and OCD symptoms. Though she doesn't have any major dialogue in the scenes, her story is revealed through visual clues and a radio talk show host.
Creepler was apprehended last March when Diorama elementary school teacher Agnes Sculptham, described as a generally disinterested human being by her students, doggedly stalked the perpetrator for several weeks.
We don't know why Miss Sculptham decided she needed to be the one to capture Mr. Creepler. Perhaps she was fed up with the cops not doing their jobs, or maybe she just wanted to give herself some greater purpose. Regardless, the decision left her scarred. By the time of Alone, she's a jumbled mess of nerves. She clearly isn't comfortable in her own home. Understandable, since that's where Creepler's attack took place. And she checks the locks over and over and over again, not even trusting her own mind. We see a bloody coat hanger, which is a visual shorthand for a DIY abortion, and even that word triggers severe Christian guilt in her. From her use of the hanger, rather than, say, an abortion clinic, we can infer one of two things, and neither are good. Either she's so pressured by the fundamentalism of Moralton that she just couldn't show her face in an abortion clinic, or Moral Orel predicted the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Fun stuff either way. Sadly, her troubles didn't end there. Throughout the second half of the vignette, the talk show host describes Miss Sculptham's actions in capturing Creepler. And while the segment outwardly praises her for her heroic actions, as the announcer states, they also can't help but take small jabs at her.
Teacher Agnes Sculptham, described as a generally disinterested human being by her students.
At the same time, he minimizes Creepler's actions by describing him as
A violent, brunette-chasing Romeo. When asked how she came to catch this perverted ragamuffin,
none of these things are objectively untrue statements, but they paint a much different picture than the reality of the situation. It's a perfect skewering of the media's tendency, especially at the time, to tacitly take the side of the man in the situation, no matter how bad his deeds were. But as you can imagine, this narrative doesn't help Miss Sculptham's already distraught mental state. She begins to fantasize about Creepler, performing sexual acts with him. Unfortunately, this is actually a real phenomena. Victims of sexual assault can sometimes feel conflicting feelings of fear and lust towards their attackers for a variety of different reasons. It doesn't mean they're any less victims, or indeed that they deserved it, or anything of the sort. It's a coping mechanism. Nevertheless, just like with Sculptham, it can often cause women to question the validity of their victimhood. Why don't they feel the way that they're quote-unquote supposed to be feeling?
The perfect victim says no clearly and often, fights off her attacker like a honey badger, and if she can't get away, she continues to profess her non-consent throughout the encounter, ideally by shouting no, and continuing to fight as best she can. Perfect victim has the courage of 100 armchair quarterbacks. Perfect victim bites and scratches. Perfect victim spits and sobs. What she doesn't do is give in. What she doesn't do is get wet. What she doesn't do is make her breakfast.
Problem is, people are imperfect. The perfect victim doesn't exist. I'll say it again for the people in the back. The perfect victim does not exist. The human mind can have many odd or seemingly contradictory responses to stress and trauma. It doesn't make the experience any less damaging or them any less a victim. Coupled with the fact that Miss Sculptham had already been sexually repressed, it's absolutely no wonder that she has these conflicting thoughts. Again, and I can't stress this enough, that doesn't make her any less a victim. In fact, it makes her doubly one, as she likely loathes herself unjustly for having this natural response. And the town, of course, doesn't help her through these struggles, despite the fact that it would be the good Christian thing to do. Instead, they mostly ignore it altogether. If she's off in the spinster apartments alone, then they don't have to think about it. Out of sight, out of mind. We never get a resolution to Miss Sculptham's story in the same way that we do for Nurse Bendy and Joe. There was a planned episode simply titled that would have dealt with the aftermath of the incident with Creepler and Alone. However, it was scrapped, likely for being too dark. The script was reportedly posted back in 2008 on Dino Stronger Floppy Disk's MySpace page, and it can still be found online today. Boy, if Moral Oral is a dark comedy series, then this episode is fucking Vanta Black. Here's a few little excerpts for you. The first is an appointment with Dr. Potter's Wheel.
Interesting.
What's so interesting all of a sudden?
Well, for one, Miss Sculptham, there seems to be some trauma to your uterus.
Huh. Fancy that.
But the biggest damage seems to be to your utter solitude. You're pregnant.
Now that's interesting.
Probably due to your oddly heroic episode with Cecil Creepler a few months back.
Probably.
That puncture wound along your uteral wall is odd, though. Was he carrying some kind of sharp, wiry apparatus?
Yes. Now that you mention it, he was. He had one of those things you hang your clothes on.
Coat rack?
No.
Hanger. Well, mystery solved. Hopefully the fetus won't commit suicide like his father. Congratulations on the new life, I suppose.
The next parts come from a visit that Miss Sculptham and her class take to the local prison so that she can confront a rapist there for some sort of closure. The one she meets and speaks with is named Pistwell.
Cecil and I shared a cell. He constantly talked about you.
Sure he did. I put him in jail.
Yeah, I know. Women.
I came here because I need to know. What was he like?
You're asking me?
Yes. Our relationship consisted of Cecil doing all the talking with his hand over my mouth. And even then, not too much information came out of his mouth. Look, I'm here because I'm still pregnant. It's too late to get rid of it. People already know. I just wanted to learn about him so I knew what I was in for.
But I thought you got rid of it yourself.
So did I. Apparently Cecil generously gave me twins. I was able to get one of them out right where he lived, but the other slippery rascal got away.
That's so beautiful.
Not the first word that comes to my mind.
Agnes, will you marry me?
What?
I know, I'm a rapist.
No, it's not only that, but you're in jail.
A convict can marry any woman who wants to marry him back. This is America. And it's the only legal thing I've ever wanted to do, to make an honest woman out of you.
Uh-oh.
What the f... Frances Clara Censordoll, her initials spelling out FCC, is aptly named as she acts as the morality police for the town of Moralton. She is more aggressive and zealous in her control over the town than even Reverend Putty, and seems to take a vicious joy in exerting that control over others. So, what would cause a person to become so twisted and angry? Well, how about the non-consensual mutilation of her body? The forced removal of the singular purpose that her society and religion has given her. The single biggest piece of information we learn about Censordoll in the episode, and really the entire series, is that her mother had her eggs surgically removed as an infant.
Yes, dry as a hen's. My mother saw to that.
Likely, the procedure was actually a bilateral oophorectomy, in which both ovaries are removed. According to the NIH, such a procedure, quote, renders a patient infertile and menopausal with ensuing physiological changes and risks. And, according to the Mayo Clinic, the side effects of the procedure when performed before natural menopause can include accelerated aging, including a greater decline in both physical and cognitive function, specifically with symptoms such as depression, anxiety, heart disease, memory problems, decreased sex drive, and osteoporosis. So this procedure, again conducted when she was an infant, completely changed the way Miss Censordoll's body developed and functioned. She would have been a prepubescent, yet menopausal girl, seemingly aging faster than her peers. Not only would she know that something had been taken from her, but the evidence would have been visible to anybody looking. And as we said with the other two women, this would have immediately marked her as an invalid to the rest of the town, since a good, God-fearing Moraltonian woman's purpose is, of course, birthing and raising children. It's hard to even imagine what sort of psychological toll this would have put on Miss Censordoll, especially when her religion, the most important thing in her life, was telling her the same thing. Not just a pariah to her peers, but her elders, even her deity. Is it any wonder then why she turned out to be the person she is in Alone? A scheming woman looking to take the power and control she had been denied her entire life. She has tried so hard to take back her narrative that she's overshot, and instead believes herself to be above everyone else, that her inability to conceive makes her immaculate, above sin, hence the contradiction in her character. Her faith in God is so strong that she goes on personal crusades throughout the series, yet is willing to do explicitly sinful things to ensure she always gets her way.
How do you like it?
All natural.
Take her adultery with Clay, for example. One of her religion's worst crimes, yet it doesn't for a second shake her confidence in the righteousness of her mission, at least not from what we can see. But in Alone, we finally get a peek inside Censordoll's inner world. Her room is sparse and tidy, an indication of the absolute control she needs to feel over her environment. She's expecting a call from her mother, who seems to have similar control issues. She toys with a scale model of Moralton, complete with Clay and Orel depicted on their hunting trip.
Citizens, our fair entire town is yearning for the guiding wing of a nurturing, life-giving matriarch.
She sees herself as the shepherd, benevolently guiding her flock of Moraltonians to a state of moral purity and complete piousness. And she rationalizes the dirty stuff she does as it's all in service to that overriding goal. It feeds into the need for her control over her environment, because if everything is predictable, then nothing can hurt her. The massive amount of unresolved, chaotic trauma from her childhood ultimately resulted in this sad, bitter woman, worn by life well past her actual years. In a way, she is the photo negative of Nurse Bendy, completely, unwillingly disqualified from any kind of romantic relationship, where the other woman was repeatedly taken advantage of sexually. The two just go to show that in a society such as Moralton, women who don't fit the stereotypical 50s trad wife mold are cast out, no matter which side they lie on. This is why Miss Censordoll separated herself from society. It's why she isolated herself emotionally. It's why she is also alone. In a fundamentalist Christian community such as Moralton, women are often cast aside should they not fit that mold of the traditional housewife, the caregiver that we've talked about. We've already seen with Bloberta and others how such expectations can be harmful, even when things ostensibly work out. But Nurse Bendy and Mrs. Sculptham and Censordoll show us the darker side that typically gets overlooked. Each of their loneliness and trauma intersects at their sexuality, or lack thereof. A woman's ability to breed and birth the next generation is the only true respected occupation in Moralton. Nurse Bendy can't get men to look at her for anything other than a quick lay, and is constantly being taken advantage of to the point that she's regressed psychologically. Miss Sculptham's lifelong celibacy had so repressed her sexuality, both in the physical connection and just in general knowledge on the topic, that she begins to fantasize about her rapist. And Miss Censordoll was so warped by being mutilated and ruined for any possible romantic interests that she became this bitter woman. Make no mistake, these characters, while extreme, are absolutely analogs of the real thing, which still exists in this world. Social media has definitely allowed for more knowledge and freedom, but it's also revitalized some of these old world ideas, like those that permeate Moralton. Trends such as tradwife TikTokers, red pillars, and MRAs and the like have begun to mainstream these ideas, and I've personally seen them pop up in kids as young as like 10. I'm hopeful that these messages continue to be constantly challenged though, and shown to hold no water. At the same time, those of us that see these ideas as dangerous can't just rest on our laurels and expect things to be better. We have to speak up. So then, why is it that Alone got the show canceled? Well, it's simple, really. It just wasn't funny. There was absolutely nothing funny about Nurse Bendy and Miss Sculptham being assaulted. There's nothing funny about Miss Censordoll's mutilation. Their trauma responses and coping mechanisms weren't funny. None of it was funny, and that was no accident. Moral Oral was genre blending before it was cool, and the world, or at least the Adult Swim bigwigs, weren't quite ready for it yet. In an interview with Vice, creator Django Spin on Top of Us talks about a conversation with Adult Swim creator Mike Lazo about another Season 3 episode.
Lazo wrote me after reading the episode Numb and said, "There's only one joke in this script." I wrote him back tongue-in-cheek and said, "Well, tell me where the joke is and I'll take it out."
Bred from the land of the Acropolis, like Bacchus straight from a Festivus, all up and mischievous, Dino Stamatopoulos, always seeking insanity, keeping close to calamity.